means that we're streaming now. So we'll get started. Glad that some of you could make it this morning. Obviously, some people are having a little trouble with the clocks and maybe with the snow. Uh, but glad to see you all here. This morning's chapter from the book we've been working on, which is called Represent Jesus, um, is on a topic called Jesus and Relationships. And this is, I think, for me, the biggest chapter uh, in the book because he's dealing with things which I think are maybe a little hard to untangle. Uh, I think our author would agree that it's a tricky subject because he actually took this chapter and expanded it into a whole other book, which he published a few years later. And that book was the subject of a class that Reverend Taylor and Kim taught in this space 2 or 3 months ago, I would say. So some of it may be repetitious. But this whole topic of relationships is something that people are concerned about, but we don't typically find, or we don't typically think we find, a whole lot of guidance in the scriptures about it. Dr. Daniels argues that there are indirect references and lessons to be learned, and we'll take a quick look at those this morning. And then I think, probably the last maybe half of our time, I'm going to be asking you questions about how to apply some of these lessons, because I think that's where things get really sticky and tricky. One of the very first points that Dr. Daniels makes is that Jesus, in fact, was very deliberate and very intentional about the way he related to people. And he points out a number of instances in Scripture to support that. But that in and of itself assumes that that Jesus had a certain understanding of people that sometimes I think we don't always have. Dr. Daniels points out that very often our human relationships are primarily driven by emotion. We meet someone new and we sense that they're similar to us in some way, or that we can identify with them in some way. We like that person. We encounter and we may try to maybe spend more time with that person, get to know that person's better. If we encounter someone who just doesn't click, it's like we kind of pass that on and move that along. But it's the emotional decisions that very often drive who we choose to spend our time with, who we build friendships with. And that's certainly understandable and natural. But Jesus had to deal with the entire spectrum of humanity, including likable and unlikable people, people who were supportive of him, and people who were his opponents. And Dr. Daniels suggests here that, in fact, as disciples, we need to have that same kind of discernment in our relationships. I'll read a little bit from his book here. He says, if there is one area in which we must put this principle into practice, it is in the area of our relationships. Our greatest joy and greatest pain come from relationships. Weddings, births, family reunions are catalysts for great joy, but divorce, funerals, and arguments cause some of our greatest pain. People are imperfect. Trouble is inevitable. Life is a mixture of pleasure and pain. But some pain can be avoided if we utilize our minds, specifically in this area. By and large, relationships tend to be the place where people lead with their hearts instead of their heads. If this is true in your life, then I'm sure it's also challenging for you to figure out how to relate to people. Oftentimes, our emotional intelligence, let's say the way we're able to read people emotionally, affects our relational intelligence. So if we live by how we feel and allow our emotions to dictate our interactions concerning who can enter or exit our lives, then we will certainly lose the value of the unique gift God gave for our protection, our minds. All of that is to say this: failure to guard your emotions will result in a world of trouble. Okay, but then what's the alternative? How do I navigate the world? We all have some defense mechanisms that we accumulated over our lifetimes. At least most of us do. Hope we do. So, if we encounter a stranger and that stranger looks a little bit hinky, we tend to take steps to avoid getting hurt by that relationship. We have sort of, we call it relational antenna. We can sense sometimes that, no, this person's not up to any good, those kinds of things. And of course, we're encouraged to identify with people, including people we've never met and never will meet, by the way they are presented to us through media. And the people who do that, of course, are very careful and very selective about the images that they give us because they want to touch that emotional side of us. Oh, yeah, this is a good guy. I understand this person. I can identify with this person. Whatever they're wearing, whatever they're eating, whatever they're driving, I should eat or wear or drive that too because they're like me. So they play on that all the time, and we're accustomed to having our emotional personality constantly touched and spoken to. There's little financial or other incentive to sharpen our other senses. And this is what Dr. Daniels is suggesting. He says we need to sharpen up our other senses in terms of our relationships with people. And he gives the example of Jesus, and particularly in this book, in this first part, this chapter, he gives the example of Jesus at the Last Supper, which is kind of a funny place to start. But he says, look what's happening there. Jesus is with 12 other people, and yet not everybody's on the same page. Peter's having an issue with Jesus washing his feet. Right? So there's a discussion about that. Judas, on the other hand, has a different agenda entirely. He's getting ready to betray Jesus. And Jesus knows this. He knows this about all the people in the room. Jesus has been with these people long enough. He knows what's going on. And he points out that Jesus relates to these people differently. It's not that Jesus doesn't love all these people, but loving people doesn't mean treating them all the same way. It doesn't mean trusting them all to the same degree. It doesn't mean making yourself vulnerable to the same degree. There are discernments that have to happen about who you can trust and who you can't, who you can rely on, who you can't, who's going to understand you, who won't. The other thing we need to be aware about and we'll be aware of is that relationships change us too. The things that we spend our time on and the people we spend our time with do affect our spiritual growth, our spiritual development. And not merely our spiritual development, but also our psychological, our mental health. A couple of examples here. Proverbs, he quotes Proverbs 13. Hang on. I was prepared today. I put a bookmark in the Bible, and it just slipped out and fell on the floor. So, I'll read it from the book. Proverbs 13:20. Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. um, this is Proverbs 13, verse 20. Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. So other translations say, if you hang out with fools, you'll be a fool too, or something like that. There's lots of interesting translations of that. 27:17 in Proverbs says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. Now that's a more positive take on it. Okay. So who we hang with, who influences our thoughts, who we go out and have fun with, all will affect who we become. And Paul's quote in 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, don't be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. So there's the negative side of it. It can be bad. It can be good. It can be bad. Here's another quote from Dr. Daniels on the issues, on the difficulty of letting our emotions drive our choices in terms of relationships. He says, do not misunderstand my observation. Your emotions are gifts from God, and I'm not suggesting we should engage life without them. We just can't always believe our emotions. Emotions are tremendous translators of one's mood, feelings, and expressions, but when it comes to how we relate to others, our emotions can cloud our judgment. They can convince us to stay in a situation that we desperately need to get out of, or leave a situation that we need to stay in. Emotions are tentative, ephemeral. Today you may want companionship. Tomorrow you may want breathing space. Today you may fear the hard conversation. Tomorrow you may want to knock down someone's door to confront them. It sounds like an emotionally unstable person to me. Nobody I know, right? Today you may want to change your major. You're talking about a college major. Based on a bad test grade. Tomorrow you may meet the greatest mentor who convinces you to stick it out. To sum up, so we can't make decisions based purely on emotions. We need to let our minds, God's gift to us, play a role in what we do, and especially when it comes to our relationships. Now here's where it gets a little more tricky. He says, bad company corrupts good character. Therefore, some people become products of their poor environments, even though they are genuinely nice people. Bad people are not always bad, but they can be bad for you. You have to use your mind to figure out which is which. Well, that's a lot of help, isn't it? He says, he's saying basically, you have to understand people may have come through hard times, and there may be some rough edges on them because of the hard life they've had, but there still may be a place for them in your life. It still might be important for you to relate to them. And on the other hand, maybe not. Okay, well, I told you this was the trickiest chapter in the book for me so far, so we'll just kind of hang with it. He's saying, what he says basically is, well, if you're in relationships that aren't good for you, if you're in a relationship which isn't good for you, you need to get out of that relationship. But maybe you need to stay in that relationship. He isn't giving us a clear answer here. Okay. So yeah, you say, we tend to be attracted to positive people. And if you're a positive person, people will be attracted to you, probably. That's probably true. Okay. Well, let's go ahead. There's a little bit more. He does go somewhere in this chapter which focuses it a little better, I think. So Here's a quote, and again, it doesn't help us, but I think it sums up his thinking on this process. He says, everyone should be treated right, but not everyone should be treated the same. Okay. But if not everybody is supposed to be treated the same, how do I decide how to treat people? Uh-huh. Here's another quote that he relies on heavily in this chapter. It's in Luke chapter 6. Here we go. Excuse me. Luke chapter 6. Starting with verse 43. Excuse me. Jesus says, a healthy tree does not bear bad fruit, nor does a poor tree bear good fruit. Every tree is known by the fruit it bears. You do not pick figs from thorn bushes or gather grapes from bramble bushes. A good person brings good out of the treasure of good things in his heart. A bad person brings out bad out of his treasure of bad things. For the mouth speaks of what the heart is full of. So Dr. Daniel says, okay, then you have to judge the fruit. Jesus told us to pay attention to the fruit, and that gives you some guideline. If you're in a situation, might be a coworker at work or something like that, where every time you work with that person, it just turns out bad, that might be a clue that you probably maybe you should be trying to work with other people instead. There are certain people that just, it just doesn't seem to work for. There's also a moral dimension to this. As Christians, if we spend a lot of our time with people whose behavior is not consistent with Christian discipleship, then it's liable to influence our behavior in a negative way. And we need to be attentive to that as well. So now we're getting down to the part of the book which is kind of focuses the difficulties that I've been identifying here. Daniels has a system supposed to help us figure out how to manage these relationships. He says you can put people into one of four broad categories. Some of you may remember that from the presentation on his other book that was made a few months ago. He says there are parasites, there are assignments, there are partners, and there are promoters. Gosh, that was easy. Everybody got that? We're done. Oh, no. Okay. He says parasites, you know what a parasite is, right? It's another organism that attaches itself to you and gets its energy and its life sustenance from you, but it doesn't really help you out too much. In fact, it may make you sick. So Dr. Dan is suggesting there are people like that. And he says the parasites are the ones that you really need to get space from. He says you find someone that's always talking you into some situation where you get into trouble. Someone takes a lot of energy from you and never gives anything back. You understand what I'm talking about, right? All right. So what's the difference between a parasite and a baby? If you're a nursing mother, you've got this thing that attaches itself to you and draws your life sustenance out. It doesn't give much back until it's time to change the diaper, right? But why would you? Yeah, they could smile. Yeah, okay. Why would you stick with that parasite and not with an adult parasite? I'm sorry. Speak up. A baby is what? Oh, the baby is defenseless. The baby can't help being a baby. All right. Anything else? Okay, the baby grows. At least we hope so. I'm sorry. Somebody else? Yeah, well, sure, it depends on you. A parasitic adult could be very dependent on you too. It could be the person that's coming around for you asking all the money because, and you suspect they're using the money to buy drugs, you know, but they're very attached to you as long as you are that source of funding for their habit. Baby can be what? Taught. Okay, so one of the dimensions, and I'm glad you picked this out. I think he doesn't mention this specifically in the book, but it's sort of implicit in some of the things he's saying. You expect the investment in the baby to cause the baby to grow into an adult, right? And become more sufficient, more self sufficient. In time, over a number of years, that relationship could be reversed. You're too old to go shopping by yourself, or maybe your kids will show up once a week and take you shopping. Nobody knows what I'm talking about. Okay, all right. But there's the sense that the investment that you're making is causing some growth and some development and to something positive to come out of it. So when he uses the term parasites, he's talking, I think, about a dead end, which doesn't seem to show any possibility of that person ever becoming more independent, more able to fend for themselves, that you're becoming kind of an enabler of a person's negative lifestyle. I think that's what he means. He doesn't specify it quite so clearly in the book, but because the second, oh yes, ma'am. Okay. Oh, okay. Babies make you happy while you. Well, I've been around a few babies. I think some people get more joy out of babies than others. I'll just say it that way. Sometime at 3 in the morning when a diaper needs to be changed, it's like, whose turn is it to get up? No, it's your turn. No, it's your turn. No, it's your. I understand where you're coming from. Yeah, but that's part of the emotional reward that he was talking about in the relationship too. That is. Oh, okay. So that would be another dimension that at some point the baby you expect to detach, you say, from the relationship and become grown. Yeah, okay. Which changes the dynamic of the relationship. It doesn't stay in that dependent kind of mode forever. Okay, that would be another one. Because the parasite doesn't give up as long as it can hang on. All right. Okay. Well, that's. I think that's an interesting observation. You say in the case of the baby and the mother, there's love involved and something positive, constructive, whereas the parasitic organism on you isn't trying to be. You're not really trying to make that parasite healthy. That's not your intention. To make the tapeworms happy or the ticks or whatever they might be. Okay. His second category is assignments, and this gets more kind of where we're going with this. He says there are some people that in your life, because God wants them in your life, and they are an assignment for you. That is to say, there's some respect in which you should be helping them. God intends you to be helping them uh, for their good and maybe for yours. But it's part of God's purpose, and I think the baby probably falls more into that category than into the parasitic category. But that it's not just children, of course. Um, there are people who may need a little help getting on their feet. There are people who may we may be able to serve in some other way, just to be neighborly or something like that. Sometimes relationships that develop um, with people that we're not initially attracted to, over time, as we get to know them better, things come of it that are positive. You understand what I'm talking about? Anybody understand? Okay. All right. Say what? A bond? Yes. Yeah, there's a bond there. Okay. And we hope that that relationship lasts for the lifetime of both persons. This could be reflected in a lot of the service that people do in a place like Oakdale, right? If you're in the choir and you're singing, you're providing a service to people, right? And Daniels would argue that that's God's assignment for you. We might call that a ministry, right? In other words, it's not a one-time thing necessarily. It's not just something that happens, but it's something about which we are intentional. We're going to show up at a particular time. We're going to provide a particular service. He says that's an assignment. And says we shouldn't look down on those relationships. Those are important relationships. Those are good relationships. Not everybody that we encounter can be a partner. We just don't have the time or energy to know that many people that well. But there's a whole lot of people that we encounter every week that we can serve. Don't have to know everything about you in order to serve you. I use the example of the musicians, pastors' sermons, people who work with children in children's church. We go on and on and on and on. A whole lot of those kinds of things. The third category that he identifies is partners. Well, before that, I'm going to read a little bit about assignments because there's a particular here. He says parasites should not be confused with assignments. Assignments are ministry connections. They are different than parasitic people because while they may take from you and be needy in some ways, God has assigned them to your life for a particular purpose. Your job is to do your part and help your assignment. Render service to them as service to the Lord. Now, remember I read that parable of Jesus last week about the final judgment? You remember that? He says, whenever you did it for one of these, you did it for me. Whenever you refused to do it for me, you refused one of them, you refused me. He says, on that note, here's the word of caution. Do not date your assignment. Do not marry your assignment. Love that person enough to help them accomplish their purpose and look for no earthly reward from the person you are called to assist. God is going to reward you for your labor because God puts assignment in your life for a purpose. Okay? Now, without getting too personal about this, how often have you observed, I'm not talking about you, I'm just talking about somebody else, a relationship where people are together, maybe even married together, but there seems to be an asymmetry in the relationship because one person is taking care of the other and the other is perfectly happy to just be taken care of. Don't raise your hand. You could nod if you've heard about this or seen this or something like this. And how much frustration there can be in such a long-term relationship, a long-term committed relationship, if there's no sense of reciprocity, if there's no sense of balance, if there's no sense of partnership. Okay. So the third category he talks about is partnership. And this is, now it doesn't mean that God doesn't put this person in your life. They did, but they put this person in your life to be your partner, to help you. You help them, they help you. There's reciprocity. think everyone understands conceptually what that is, right? So, what happens to a partnership if one of the partners has a stroke or becomes ill, just can't perform what they used to perform? Is it still a partnership? Some people are nodding. Well, please tell me why. Because you create a situation where, let's say it's a marriage, where both these people were, when they were young, were both active and energetic and strong, and everything seemed to be going right. One of them is in an automobile accident and can no longer walk, which means that someone has to push them around in a wheelchair, unless they got one of those fancy motorized ones in which they can tear around on themselves. Does that mean the partnership is over? Is it turning into a no? Say no. Okay, well, why isn't it? It looks like from the outside, it looks like that's the case, right? One of the partners has Alzheimer's and has to be, watched all the time. Somebody said something about a bond. What? It's a contract. Oh, yeah, people do. Well, you say you can't see somebody walking away, but what if it's not walking away? What if it's just accepting that the relationship dynamic has changed, and that now this person is dependent, is the weak one? Does that change the partnership? People say, no, y'all are romantic. I got to say that for you. Okay, so it comes back, it really does come back to more the sense that God has a purpose in it. Yeah. Okay. The fourth and final category that he talks about is what he calls promoters. And you might be their assignment. These are the people who are pouring into you and helping you grow. Of course, we think of pastoral people, uh, other people who are mentoring us or helping us in some way. Um, that is something that we, I think, sometimes overlook. We professionalize it to a certain extent. We expect a pastor, right? We expect a pastor to know the people and care for the people like a shepherd guards the flock and so forth and so on. We're not always, I think, as perceptive uh, and maybe not always as grateful to the other people in our lives who continue to support us and promote us and to call us to do more than maybe we're comfortable doing. But Jesus certainly did that with his disciples. And that's something that we need to be open to as well. Uh, God may put some people in our lives for us to be promoters, to us to encourage them, to build them up, to lead them to taking on challenges that they might not be willing to take so that they can grow. All right, well, I said that this, at the beginning of this lesson, was, I think, one of the more tricky ones for me because it's very easy to get into a mode of start putting people in your life into one of these four buckets. And I don't think it's as rigid as that. I think that as an analytical tool, maybe this is helpful. But as we noted, babies who may seem like parasites when they're really young, nonetheless, it's an assignment. And there's growth possibilities there. It's possible that an adult relationship, which seems parasitic or codependent, can grow into something else. One of the differences between a baby and an adult with babies and children, somebody has to set expectations, guidelines, and structure. You follow what I'm saying? In order for the baby to grow, it has to have structure. There has to be limits to what it can do. It has to learn how to function in those limits in order to become an adult. If you're in a relationship with another adult that feels parasitic, one way to redeem that relationship may be to figure out where to set the guidelines, where to set the boundaries that may be resistant. They may decide you're not worth it anymore. You don't need to feel guilty about that. Setting those limits, say, no, I won't do that for you. I won't lie for you. I won't do this or this or that for you. Creates the possibility of a more healthy adult relationship. But it may cause the other person to say, I don't want any part of this. I'm going to find someone else who will let me do what I want to do when I want to do it, you know. And that's not something that Dr. Dans mentions is don't let guilt manipulate you that way. Be intentional, be thoughtful about your relationships. And that's a summarization. I want to give a couple minutes if anybody has any other remarks or questions, and then we'll close in prayer. Yes, ma'am. Okay, that's a term that he uses too. Some relationships are seasonal, and he says that's not a bad thing. If you're being promoted by somebody or mentored by somebody, there's a point in the future where that's probably going to end because the job will be done and you'll be where you need to be, and then you'll be able to move on. And it goes the other way too. When you're helping other people, especially if it's a baby, there's a point where you expect that person is going to move on, and that's okay. That changes the relationship, but that's okay. Anyone else? Either you're half asleep or I just said it all. I don't know. One of the other two. Okay. Well, this is the eighth, actually, chapter in the book. So we've got 4 more to go. And I don't know yet what's going to be in this time and space. But in about a month, there'll be somebody else doing something else, I think. Yes, ma'am. Oh, yes. There's the book. Come see me after. I'll tell you what the title and everything is. A couple of people have approached me and said they found the book helpful. And I think that means they've been reading ahead. So if that's a recommendation, that's good. Okay. I'm trying to think if there's any more announcements that need to be made. I can't. All right. Father in heaven, thank you for putting us into a world with other people and with all the complexities that come with relationships with those people. Help us to be wise. Help us to be intentional. Help us to be faithful and hopeful in all the relationships that are part of our lives. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.